Hello, and welcome to For Your Information, the Cutchogue-New Suffolk Free Library podcast. I'm your host, Emma Layden, Emerging Technologies Librarian here at the Cutchogue-New Suffolk Free Library. Thanks for joining us. Today, I am sitting down with Mark MacNish. We're going to be discussing the history of Cutchogue-New Suffolk leading up to and through the Revolutionary War in honor of America 250. I'm going to have Mark. Mark, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
I am the Executive Director of the Cutchogue-New Suffolk Historical Council and Museums. We're responsible for all the buildings on the Village Green. We maintain them and keep them up and present them for people to tour during our opening season in the summer. We also own and maintain the Cutchogue Old Burying Ground about a mile east of the Village Green.
Thank you so much for coming in today to discuss the history of the area. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'm excited to get into it with you. To start, if you could kind of contextualize Cutchogue, this area in the lead up to the Revolutionary War.
The North Fork, Southwold town, actually was kind of settled in 1640. Although some people think it was settled a little bit earlier than that. The families that came here came from Connecticut, actually. They originally came from England. They spent a little time in Connecticut, and then they decided to come here. The original families are families that we know by the names of our streets, mostly. It's the Hallecks, the Hortons, the Tuttles, the Wickhams, all of these people and more are the people that settled in this area, predominantly English. And then later on, more families came to develop the area, and they all originally were farmers. They had to farm to live, so they divided up the land and farmed it. And that went on through the 17th and 18th century. So in the 18th century, you started to see that everyone was still farmers, but a lot of them had other occupations. So you were probably a farmer and a lawyer, a farmer and a hat maker, a farmer and a cooper, a farmer and a cobbler. But you were predominantly, if you wanted to live, a farmer. And then as they became more wealthy, more prosperous, they were able to do things independently of farming. But still, right before the Revolutionary War, farming was extremely important. You needed to farm pretty much if you wanted to live. They also were protecting themselves by mustering every Sunday. Something that would be unusual for us to imagine is that they would go to church with their guns. In fact, the Southwold Church had a gun rack, which still exists and is in the Long Island Museum in Brooklyn. And they would rack their guns and go into church. And then after church, they would muster and practice with their guns. So they really didn't have anyone to protect them except for themselves. So they had to go through this process. And that's kind of later on how the Minuteman developed. They were just men that had guns that popped out of their bed in a minute and were ready to, fight for their freedom or for their property or whatever. There was a perceived threat of Indian attacks. There were never really any organized Indian attacks on the North Fork. They were also perceived threats of the Dutch coming in from the west. And they did come, and there were maybe a few skirmishes, but nothing really to speak of. But they always felt that they had to be ready for anything. I just wanted to mention, too, that leading up to the Revolutionary War, there was the French and Indian War. And that seems something very foreign to us, that we maybe were not a part of it, but we actually were. 150 of the Minutemen, the men from Southwold, were sent to fight in the French-Indian War. They fought right next to the British, and they were involved in the defeat at Fort Ticonderoga. So coming home, there was Lieutenant Simeon Benjamin and Silas Horton, who are buried in the Cutchogue Burying Ground. They fought in the French and Indian War. But the thing is that they came back with a new hatred for the British because they were treated very poorly. The British concept of a soldier is more of an aristocratic calling, that you were proper, you were very trained, well trained, and they had these guys that were basically farmers who knew how to shoot a gun but knew nothing about war. And they looked down upon them and they treated them very poorly. They beat them in many cases. They would not listen to their advice. So basically the men of Southold came back kind of dejected and with a newfound hatred for the English. By the time the Revolutionary War came, there was definitely feelings of rebellion here on the North Fork. It wasn't just like an us versus them type of fight. It was a lot of us versus them versus us versus us. So there were like relatives. It's often been described as America's first Civil War because there were people who were loyal to the king that had brothers and sisters who were not. So they were kind of fighting against each other. Around 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed in July, 1 month later in August, the Battle of Brooklyn occurred. It was really George Washington's first big battle of the war. He was defeated horribly. It was a really bad situation. And once he was defeated, he left Long Island undefended. And New York Congress immediately sent word out to the east end of Long Island, basically telling everyone to leave to Connecticut, because Connecticut was a Patriot stronghold. The way they worded it, it sounded like they were trying to protect the people of Long Island, that they wanted them to take their children, their parents, and their women, and all of their livestock and all of their provisions and leave Long Island and go to Connecticut. But what it really was, well, I'm sure they wanted to protect them too, but what it really was militarily and strategically, it was basically that they wanted to get as much of those provisions and people away from the enemy so that they did not have access to it. And in particular, they highlighted that they should leave with their slaves because they saw the slaves as vulnerable to the English, convincing them that they would be freed if they fought on the side of the English. The numbers are really unclear, but I would say between 1/3 and 3/4 of the Southold population went to Connecticut.
Wow.
So basically, it was kind of like a ghost town here. And the only people stayed were either loyalists or patriots that were trying to pass as loyalists so that they could protect their holdings here, because a lot of people left. They left their houses empty. They just basically abandoned everything. So they left it to the English to just kind of move in and take over. And in many cases, they did. And thousands of English troops by the fall had come to Southold and set up camp in Mattituck. They basically destroyed the Cutchogue Presbyterian Church. They closed the other churches. The only church they allowed open was in Mattituck, because they felt that they could keep an eye on it. Now back then, church was more than a church. It was where the town meetings were held. So if they're holding a town meeting in the Mattituck Church, they could keep like a controlling eye on what was being said, and that no rebellion or sedition was happening right underneath their noses.
And which church? Do we know which church in Mattituck it was?
The Mattituck Presbyterian Church.
It was Mattituck Presbyterian. And this, you said it was the fall, this is fall 1776?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Things were pretty bad for 7 to 9 years here after that. And people were in exile. One of the families that I'd like to use as an example is the Wickham and the Landon families. Nathan Landon came here as a cobbler in the late 17th century. He had a son named Samuel. Samuel Landon learned his father's trade as a cobbler, but he also was sent away to school to Yale to become a lawyer. And he became a very well-known and well-respected lawyer in the area. His house is actually the Thomas More House in Southold, and you can tour his house there in Southold. And he was also the Southold town supervisor. So he had a lot of important positions. He was a very important man. And by the time the war came around, he was older, and his son, Jared Landon, encouraged him to get out of town and go to Connecticut. Jared Landon's brother, David Landon, owned a sloop called the Polly. They loaded, I think, over 200 people, oxen, cattle, sheep, anything they could carry was kind of put on this ship, and they were sent to Connecticut. And once they were in Connecticut, that was it. Any communication was cut off. Any communication, I should say, was clandestine. They could communicate, but if they were caught, they would get in trouble. So there were letters going back and forth, but it was very secret. And things in Connecticut were not that great. You have to remember that these people are coming to a new place. They don't own the land. Some of them were able to rent. Some of them were not. And things were really bad. In fact, there was an outbreak of smallpox almost immediately. And many people, some people from Cutchogue were killed from the disease. So it was really kind of a grim time for us. And what really I feel kind of characterizes what went on here on the North Fork is this exile to Connecticut. And that kind of was the deciding factor of how everything played out after that. So Jared wrote letters to his father. His father was able to go back to his old job as a cobbler. So he made shoes for a lot of the people that were exiled. He was always writing to Jared, asking him for leathers, for shoes. And, they talked about the conditions here. Jared was basically saying how awful the English were to people, how they were taking over people's houses, how they were stealing sheep when they weren't pretending to buy them. And when I say pretending is that they would offer them IOUs for their sheep or their cattle or their provisions, whatever. And then people would never get paid. The English were kind of maltreating people. There's a lot of stories, like word of mouth stories, of how women kind of stood up to the English soldiers, and basically because there were mostly women here now. So those stories were, no, you can't have our family's wheat store. You can't graze your horses in our lot. So they were writing back and forth, and finally it was very difficult for someone to gain passage to return. They had to go before a council in Connecticut. You see a lot of appeals by people saying, oh, listen, I'm elderly, I'm sick, I need to return to Long Island. And that's what's in a lot of the letters. And that was in Samuel Landon's letter as well. So I read his appeal to the council. He was basically saying, I think he was over 81 at the time, and he was not in good health, and he wanted to return to see his family on Long Island. Well, they finally allowed him to go back, but this was, I think, 7 years later. Right before he was returned, he died. So Jared received his body in a coffin.
And the Landons, after the war, did they continue to hold their property? Was anything confiscated from them, or were they? That's
where the story gets interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, okay. Because Parker Wickham, who was a descendant from the Wickham family, they were, as I said, one of the original founding families. Parker's great-grandfather, Joseph, came from Southampton as a very wealthy tanner, and he purchased the old house here. He didn't just purchase the old house. He purchased vast holdings of land in Cutchogue and Roberts Island. So that was part of the old house purchase. And then he left it to his son, and then his son left it to his son, Parker Wickham. Now, Parker was named after his mother's maiden name, Abigail Parker, and she had inherited huge plot of land in Riverhead. So that was added to their estate. So Wickham at that time, Parker Wickham, was an incredibly wealthy landholder here. And he was a well-respected and well-known lawyer and an ardent loyalist. So he was the yin to Jared Landon's yang.
Okay.
So basically, they were nemesis. In fact,
really, did they have interpersonal?
Yes.
Okay.
So There was a lawsuit between Samuel Landon and Parker Wickham. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Parker Wickham won, and Jared Landon had to deliver the winnings to Parker Wickham, who at the time was in New York City. In one of the letters that I read from Jared to his father, he says, as to Parker Wickham, I don't think that Southold Town is big enough to contain the two of us.
Those are fighting words.
Yeah.
Wow.
So in his actual words, he basically said, I am his enemy. And they got each other into a lot of trouble. A lot of times Parker would tell the redcoats that basically Jared was up to no good. And he appears to have gotten him jailed. So Jared spent some time in the provost jail in the city. And it's a really horrible situation. The provost jail is awful. They were like sleeping on piles of dung. They did not get enough food. And when the rations were poor for the soldiers, they got even less. There was scurvy. There was all sorts of diseases going on in the jail. So Jared was sent to a provost jail. And it's likely that he got out by bribing because he had money. He also, at that point in history, signed an oath to the king. And that could be part of how he got out of jail as well. So you know that between Connecticut and Long Island is the Sound. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of what they call whaleboat raids coming from the Sound, where the Patriots were coming and raiding Long Island, which sounds like, oh, yay, the Patriots are coming, hooray. But they were kind of indiscriminate about the raids. They got what they needed. They took supplies a lot of times. They fought sometimes, but the supplies that they were taking were from other patriots.
Yeah.
And this one particular raid that occurred at the Mattatuck Inlet area, it was a whaleboat raid, and they actually prevented a huge supply of wood from going into the city where they were building barracks and things for the English. So it was a really successful raid, but they caught Parker Wickham. So Parker Wickham was brought to Connecticut, where he used his influence to be put on parole, sort of. Like, I don't know if it was exactly parole, but it was like he was allowed out on parole. Mm-hmm. And he almost immediately broke his parole. And they caught him. I don't know if you've heard the name Ezra Lamadou. He is a big name in the Revolutionary War. He's a local. He's from Southold. He was affiliated with George Washington. He wrote this archaic legal thing called an Act of Attainder. And when I say archaic, it goes back to medieval times. And when you were attainted, that's what it's called, when someone writes an Act of Attainder against you, it means that all of your lands and holdings are confiscated. And in addition to that, it means your blood is attainted, which means that all of your descendants are not allowed to hold this land either. So this is what they kind of dug up to use against Parker Wickham and many other loyalists. Strategically, it was so they could confiscate the lands and sell them, to kind of replenish the war funds. And all of Parker's vast holdings were confiscated. As the war ended, Parker Wickham was banished, like all of the other loyalists. Most of them went to Nova Scotia or back to England. Parker, however, because he was old and he was sick, he went to a little town around New London, Connecticut. And after his son settled him there, he was there for about a little more than a year. And he never saw his family again, and he died there. And all of his land was taken over and put up for sale. And guess who bought it? Guess who bought the old house?
Another Wickham? Or?
No, it's Jared Landon.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, his arch nemesis swooped in and bought the old house, and there he lived for several generations. And that's basically the story we tell in the old house now, is basically that Jared Landon, I think it was around 1782, took over the old house. And then for several generations,
wow.
he lived there.
Maybe the last person that Parker would have wanted to have his old property.
Absolutely, the last person, yeah.
So with the Wickhams, because obviously Wickham Farm is still there, some of those farms are still in the Wickham family.
Yes.
So how did that land wound up getting
Well, as I said, you remember when I said that basically brother and sister could be fighting against each other? Well, the same was true in the Wickham family. The family was very split. There were loyalists and there were patriots. In fact, Parker Wickham's sister, Parnell, she was a staunch patriot. She even married a Revolutionary War soldier. You know, she really was outspoken about it. Some of the family stayed behind. Some went to Connecticut. Some were banished. There's a lot of stories in the Wickham family, I'm sure. And then some of them, ended up here. Well, the story that I told is kind of bleak. What happened to us here in Cutchogue during the Revolutionary Wars is kind of more of a sad story. I like to finish it with something positive. And to me, that would be a MiG's raid, a raid that occurred during the war in the Southold area, basically from Connecticut. They came down in whaleboats. I'm not sure exactly how many, but quite a lot, like 30 or 40. And a few hundred men came with them. And they took Heshmonic Pond to the bay, and then they surprised an English fort in Sag Harbor. And they basically won that battle because they really surprised them. A lot of the soldiers were drunk, they were sleeping. Even though the Patriots were outnumbered, they were able to take like 90 prisoners or something like that. And George Washington got word of that, and after a series of defeats, they say this kind of like inspired him to move forward. So I like to think that kind of is part of what happened out here, and helped in the war effort.
And that was in when was that?
1777.
1777.
May 23rd. And the actual complete story is on our website in the blog. So if you're interested in more details, because I just kind of did a cursory overview, and it's very well marked with historical landmarks. So if you go to each one of these sites, the site in Connecticut where they launched, the site in Southold where they crossed, the site in Sag Harbor, there are plaques that you can read the whole story about.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. Wait, so if I went to Heshmonic Pond, there's one there?
Yeah. And there's pictures of them as part of the blog too, so you can see what they look like.
Mark, thank you so much for coming in. This was really awesome. I really appreciate your depth of knowledge and your storytelling. And I think people will be really excited to hear this.
Well, when it comes to history, all you have to do is turn me on. I mean, my nephews always say, whatever you do, don't ask Uncle Mark a history question because you'll never hear the end of it.
Perfect for podcasts. No, thank you so much again.
And thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a story I love telling, so.
Thanks for joining us today on For Your Information, the Cutchogue-New Suffolk Free Library podcast. I hope you tune in again soon, and I hope you learned something new. For Your Information is a production of the Cutchogue-New Suffolk Free Library. Our intro and outro music is Lavender Sky by Kaizan Blue. I'm your host, producer, editor, and emerging technologies librarian, Emma Layden. We'll catch you next time. Until then, stay open to new ideas.